All right, so if you have made it this far, thanks for hanging in there with me. Hopefully, I've helped you with something. If not, leave a comment below and tell me I'm a huge idiot. That's fine. Wouldn't be the first time. Um, but I'm just going to skim through the paint job here a little bit. Obviously, we repaint this cabinet inside and out. We have to repaint some of the trim. And of course, we got to paint the walls and the ceiling and all that kind of business. Um, yeah, I don't always mask things. I have that steady hand. I used to weld a lot, so I've got that going on for me. One quick thing, when I mask off this trim here, I leave it just shy of the inside corner and I put a bead of caulk there. Very thin bead of caulk. And what that does is it keeps the paint from creeping in behind. And if you've ever just put, blue tape on, painted and peeled back and say, oh, that looks horrible. That's why. You can't get a clean edge another way. Maybe you can get a decent edge from frog tape if you do it just right. The tile is going to get grout caulk where it meets the drywall, so I'm not going to caulk that now. I'm just going to mask it off like so. That's about it for the paint job. On to the rest of this project. All right, time to trim out the shower. Now I have a shark bite on here because I let this tube fill with water before I sweated on this fitting, and so I had to open it up, let the water out so that it would sweat. You cannot sweat any copper that has water inside of it. It just doesn't work. Now they make a little plastic piece for this, but I may or may not have one, but a crescent wrench I always have, and it works really well. This is going to be just a little bit too long, so I'm going to cut it down with a tubing cutter. At this point, it wouldn't matter if you used, a hacksaw or a sawzall or, whatever to cut this thing off now, because we're not prepping this piece of copper to solder a fitting on. So I'm just going to cut it right about here. It gives me enough room for this kind of overkill tubing cutter. Now there's no need to put any thread sealant on this fitting here. There is a little bit of, looks like maybe some grout or some thinset or something in those threads. But the threads aren't what makes the seal, it's this O-ring. So you do not have to put any thread sealer there. But if you did, I'm not going to stop you. Now if I set this up properly, this guy should be right within the range. I'm going to lube up that. I'm going to lube up that O-ring a little bit. Good old-fashioned spittle for that. All right. And this doesn't have to be crazy tight. It's an O-ring fit. And so once it's on that far, it's not likely to leak. And so you just need to snug it up until it fits nice and vertical, just like that. Okay? Now for this trim, there's this foam seal right here, and if you wanted to use some extra sealant around this, it wouldn't be a bad idea. This is one of those somewhat rare times when I'm going to use a good old-fashioned manual screwdriver. I do still own them. Okay. The little set screw finishes the job there. Let's move on up. All right. had this little jewel in here pretty tight. Your shower head doesn't need to be that tight. One of the reasons why is that there's always a hole in the end, so it never truly holds full water pressure. When it comes to this escutcheon here, you don't want to slide it way up here because that guy is aggressive and it will dig in and scratch up the finish of your neck. You want to put it on as shallow as possible. Now this joint here, I do want to put some sealant on, and I am pretty liberal with it, frankly. Just like with my glue and primer and all those kinds of things. When I count for I'm counting on a substance to seal. Sometimes I just put way more in than is really needed, but sometimes having too much is just right. Usually not. But that's the way I do those kinds of things. Now, I'd like to put this on without using any tools, but if I do, I prefer to either slide something inside of here to get some leverage or protect this finish really well before grabbing hold of it to turn. So you can run a bunch of tape over it and use a pair of pliers if you're really careful, or if you can find a nice round object that fits in here well, that's your best bet for torquing that down. This is just a piece of 5/8 round bar, and I've wrapped it with some masking tape. What I don't want to do is to oval or distort the end of this fitting. This gives me plenty of leverage. I can carefully tighten that until I have it just where I want it. Bingo. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of sealant on those threads, not like I did inside the wall. If it leaks here, it's just going to land inside of the shower. If it leaks in the wall, it could be water damage. Once I have this tightened down on here, I'm going to clean any excess off of there just for looks. Again, to protect the finish, I'm going to use some more masking tape. Just another quarter turn or so is plenty here. Don't need to set it to kill. My grout sponges I pretty much use for everything. So the main thing to know about these shower doors is these kits mostly go up the same. Otherwise you're getting a custom one that might be completely frameless and just have hinges that mount. I get those a lot, but those are usually installed by the glass company instead of from me. These kits generally compose of just a few parts. You have jambs on either side that get screwed into the tile. You have a threshold that needs to be cut to width, and you have a header that needs to be cut to width. This one had a couple extra steps. It's a little bit of a different animal. It has what they call a cleat that screws into the tile here. And I can tell you this porcelain tile is incredibly hard and difficult to cut. Inevitably, I have to use a regular carbide bit like this, but these tile bits are much better at starting the hole precisely where I want it. These are going to walk a lot more, so if you start it with one of these, if you try to continue it, you're going to burn it up. And you can burn these up as well. What happens is they get hot from all the friction and pounding, and the carbide is brazed onto the end of these bits, and that'll get hot enough that that bit will just fall. The cutting surface on the end of this bit will just fall out, and then your bit is destroyed. You can't sharpen that. Anyway, and so to counter that, what I do is I drill for a while and then I quench it in some water, and that seems to keep the bits together. These tile bits, on the other hand, they're just a little brittle and they're easier to break. and I went through a few of them mounting this. I had to put 10 holes in this hard porcelain. One thing about it, you would think that the porcelain tiles would break. They almost never do, provided they're on a full bed of mud and bonded to, you know, the wall or the floor. One of the screws on either side here was less than a half an inch from the edge of the tile. It still didn't break. All right, that's all I'm gonna say about that. Wait, I take that back. One more thing. This particular shower door, the handles are just adhered on. There's a 3M adhesive strip already applied to the handle itself, and they want you to use this little gauge, which will get you in the ballpark. This mark, by the way, represents the center line, but it's way too sloppy. You know, even if you tape it in place, you can see there's a big gap here. If you want that to be true, do what I did or find your own way. I figured my measurements and use masking tape and pencils to get it exactly where I want it. And once you have one on one side, you don't really need those marks on the other because it's clear, you can see through it. Anyway, that's enough on shower doors. In finishing plumbing, I also have a toilet to set, but before I do that, I want to take advantage of the space here to mount this cabinet. Now it is about 2 feet wide, and I want it about 4 foot off the floor. And so, you know, a great way to do that would be to just screw a board here, but then we've got drywall repair to do. So rather than take that measure, I'm going to use some of my masking tape, which I need to grab. All right, and I'm going to use blue masking tape. It's a little bit harder to see the marks on the blue, but I don't want to damage this recently painted wall. So the center of the toilet is going to be right about there, and this is a 4 foot level, so I know that the cabinet is going to sit right about here. Matter of fact, I will probably use this level to help support the cabinet when it's time to mount. So I'm going to measure over about 1 foot. I'm going to make a mark this way. All right, I'll measure about 1 foot, and I'll put another one here. And the reason for this is that now I can make a more accurate mark right here. Then I'll level across. Okay, and I'll make a mark over here. I'll remark this over here so I know that I have a good match. And then I'm just going to use the top edge of this tape as a marker, an indicator for where the bottom of my cabinet is going to go. Now this isn't perfect because if you've ever spread masking tape, you know that it can bend and flex. But that represents the bottom of my cabinet. Now the next thing I want to do is to get a nice accurate center mark, and I'll make a center mark on my cabinet as well. All right, so I've just centered that up with the flange on the floor. Now, you can see that this level will do a pretty good job of holding that cabinet where I am, and maybe I can grab a couple of shims and that'll help me hold the cabinet in place. I don't want to scuff up the wall too much and give myself a bunch of touch-up work to do though. All right, one thing to note, I will need to locate the studs in this area, which I've already done, and I have them marked inside the cabinet. Okay, before I work on this, I need to address this. Remember, I couldn't replace the regular escutcheon because I couldn't get this pipe dry enough and didn't want to deal with that business. So I have this type. This is a split ring style, and you can see it's kind of perforated across the back. You need to cut it just a little bit. And then once you get it started, hopefully it'll break loose. Okay. Now that I can twist in place and try to work its way around there. I'm also going to put some construction adhesive on the back of this because this type of flange here is just not very secure on its own. It's on there. I'm going to go ahead and put a little masking tape on it. Hopefully that'll hold it in place while that construction adhesive does its thing. All right, now let's address this flange. You can see that this has a metal repair flange where it initially had a plastic flange that had broken, and that's fine as long as this doesn't stick up too much. You only have so much clearance on the bottom of your toilet. It also needs to be really secure to the floor because that's what holds the toilet in place. Also why that broke. The floor was probably uneven, which they oftentimes are. When the slab is poured, you know, the concrete tends to pile up around these flanges, and that doesn't always get addressed in the flooring. I like to use a new set of bolts. If you can find the set that has a nut on top, that can be a big benefit. It'll keep this from walking around and turning on you when you try to tighten up the toilet. As long as you have room between the flange and the bottom of the toilet. You only have a little bit of room in there. So I have a new set, but I do not have the type with the nuts on top. But if you can use them, they are a great thing. Now, it's a good idea to dry fit your toilet. In other words, before I put that new ring on, let's make sure that I can drop it in place and it fits fine. You notice there's no cardboard on the bottom of this toilet anymore. I scraped all the old wax that I could off. I generally just use some pieces of cardboard for that. You don't want to get any of that wax on your hands if you can avoid it. Now, this type of ring has this little rubber, almost like a funnel built into it. You can install these to the bottom of the toilet. To me, it's a little like, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It doesn't really matter that much to me which side you put it on. But if you want to apply this to the bottom of the toilet, I'm not going to say you're wrong. All right, so there's that guy, and you can see this black funnel. I guess you can't see it. Well, anyway, that's just one more layer of protection to get the water to go where it needs to go. Especially this water, black water as we call it. All right, let's go ahead and set this thing on. And as I set it in, it's gonna smush all that wax everywhere. And the wax is gonna form a gasket. It'll take up all the space in between, and it actually does a really good job of making a nice seal to the floor. More importantly, to that flange. Now, you remember I left some of my parts inside of this tank, or I left all of them inside this tank, and now I know I still have them. But it's important put them together in the right order. This little plastic guy here has a taper to it, and it has a little relief right there. And that's important because that's what holds these little caps on. I'm going to clean these up before I install them. But I'll drop a washer on, throw a nut on, tighten it up, and that will be good to go. Then I'll put on the feed line, and that's the gist of this job. One thing about this type of line is there is a rubber seal inside of here, so these don't have to be super tight. There's a rubber seal on that end as well, and you can see it even has a plastic nut on it. If you tighten it too much, you can damage that rubber seal, and then good luck getting it to seal. You'll have to replace the whole line. All right, it's finally time to do my finish electrical work. I have an old work style or remodel style electrical box to put up here where this temporary light has been dangling for the last few weeks. I have new receptacle and new switches. I already have the circuits disabled for both, so I'm going to get started. When you wrap a wire around a screw like this, you want it to go around this way because as you tighten, it's going to pull the wire through and help wrap it up. If you put it in the other way, it's probably all right, but if it's going to move off of the screw if you go the other way. The holes in the top and bottom of these are elongated for a reason. One thing about these wall plates is there are unbreakable ones available, and it doesn't really matter because either way, you don't want to over tighten them. If you over tighten the unbreakable ones, they just bend all over the place. If you over tighten the breakable ones, they break. I do like to have the slots on the screw heads to be level when I'm done. That's just my preference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another line on the inside. And I'm just going to freehand it. Then I'm going to drop my pencil. Could also use a small keyhole saw or something like that. But those are all messier than this. So this may not be the easiest, but there's nothing wrong with using a good old-fashioned knife to cut your holes out. It's not going to take me that long. The one drawback to this is that it can bust out the paper on the back of my drywall. So I want to use a pretty sharp, a fairly fresh knife as I do this. Now once I get this hole cut, that box isn't just going to pop right in. It just doesn't work that way. I'm going to have to cut little notches for all those kind of wings and lugs that interfere with fitting here. That's just the way it goes. I'm pretty close. Just gonna make a few marks. All right. Just gotta make a little clearance. The way this kind of box works is there's those 3 little wings that are stuck onto those 3 screws. And as you start to tighten those screws, the wings flip out. So you need to make sure you have clearance for those to flip out. And then as you tighten them, they grab the back side of the box and pull it into the wall. And of course, it stops where the outside flange on the box hits the wall. So it squeezes the drywall, and that's what holds that box in place. I'm going to strip the outer layer of insulation off of my wire here. All right. Come on, doctor. Okay. Now I'm going to feed one wire on each side of this just so that there's room. Also, since the orientation of this light is depending upon these 2 bolts here, I want them to be plumb to each other. Okay, so I've already found center and I've marked it on this piece of tape. And this light comes with a little template that you can cut out, but I find that's just a little bit too large. And if I cover up my mark, I can't see the center. So what I do is I fold it in half, both ways, to find the center. Okay, and then I just run a regular wood screw through the template and into the center mark that I've already found here. One thing I should mention is that these recessed lights, or can lights, can be tall. And if you don't check to make sure, you might run into a rafter or something like that. So next thing I'm going to do is I'll cut a tiny little notch in this. And that notch is where I'm going to put my pencil. That'll give me just a little bit smaller hole. I want it to be a little tighter around my light. Let me show you how this light works. There's an electrical box on top with knockout plugs, and you'll need an electrical connector to go in there. You don't want to just leave that wire loose. Now these are the little springs that will hold it in place, and that's why their template is oversized, because these have to fit through. What happens is that goes up, and then as you push the light in, this is going to fold down, and the drywall itself will hold that tight against the body, and then this side of the spring holds it up. And so rather than make the entire hole that big, I'm going to cut some notches for these springs. Now before I push this all the way into the ceiling, I'm going to test it and make sure it works, because I don't want to move it in and out of that hole any more than I absolutely have to. So my work here is just about done. We had about $2,000 worth of building materials and supplies, but remember that does not include cabinets, sink top, faucet, or toilet. So that would be an extra expense if we had to replace those, obviously. Now, this took about 3 weeks, and I couldn't be much happier with the results. It really turned out great. Thanks for watching.